Hello, I'm Steve Surfoss, talking still about free will. This time I'd like to go into the New Testament. We're going to jump over to Romans chapter 10, which would be a very important chapter in looking at the issue of free will. Not just a few isolated verses there, but really the flow of logic as Paul teaches there, the things that he takes note of there. And let me say this, as every time I've taught the book of Romans, I've explained to people that if they only read Romans 9, which is really about the sovereignty of God and how God chooses, they're going to have one idea about God and man. If they only read chapter 10, they're going to have another idea about God. I think the biblical doctrine is to really take chapter 9 of Romans and chapter 10 of Romans and understand how they go together. Now, for right now, we're not going to do that. I hope to begin to post some videos that would be just a study of the whole book of Romans. I really think it's worth going through and studying the whole book. It's got some great, important teaching, especially in our day when it seems like a lot of people just want to make up their doctrine, kind of pull it out of the sleeve and go with that. Romans chapter 10, and I'm going to read the text as of verse 5 and possibly pause for some comments along the way, or maybe it'd be good to read the whole thing first. Romans 10 verse 5 says, Moses describes in this way the righteousness that is by the law. The man who does these things will live by them. But the righteousness that is by faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend to heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the deep, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does he say? The word is near you. It is in your mouth. It is in your mouth. It is in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith we are proclaiming. That if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you confess and are saved. As the Scripture says, anyone who trusts in him will never be put to shame. For there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all and richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. But not all the Israelites accepted the good news. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? Consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word of Christ. But I ask, did they not hear? Of course they did. Their voice has gone out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. Again I ask, did Israel not understand? First Moses says, I will make you envious by those who are not a nation. I will make you angry by a nation that has no understanding. And Isaiah boldly says, I was found by those who did not seek me. I revealed myself to those who did not ask for me. But concerning Israel, he says, all day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people. So this chapter, again, very important. We notice as we read it that this is in a section, chapters 9, 10, 11 of Romans, or a section in Romans where Paul is saying, what about the children of Israel? What about the people of Israel, the nation of Israel? He has basically in chapters 1 through 8 shown that you can be justified by faith without the law. You can be sanctified, and you're not going to use the law to be sanctified. God is going to glorify us. And all of those things really are the heart of what it means to be a Christian, and the benefits and what it is to just have Christianity. He says all those things we've had without the law. So he said, well, now what about the children of Israel? And so these 9, 10, and 11, he really agonizes and shares his heart for Israel. his own people in these chapters. But in the middle of that, he talks about God's working. He's trying to explain what's happening with Israel, so he talks about God's working. Chapter 9, as I've pointed out, and I don't want to have anyone going away thinking, well, I'm just ignorant of chapter 9. And chapter 9 is God's sovereignty. It doesn't depend on he who runs or he who wants, but on whom God has mercy. The great thing that I learned about that chapter on sovereignty is God says, I'm going to do this in a sovereign way, so it'll be by grace and not by works. Then we go over to chapter 10, and in the verses that we've seen, and I kind of played a trick on people maybe with the video about free will in Deuteronomy 30, but I was basing my arguments and the usage of that passage precisely on Paul's usage of it here in chapter 10. He compares what Moses told the people of Israel regarding the law and regarding following God and following the law in chapter 30 of Deuteronomy with what he's been preaching to people and what he has shared in the gospel that he says that he himself declares is God's gospel and not just his own gospel. So again, he goes to practically the same verses we saw in Deuteronomy 30. And so he says, what does it say? The word is near you, it is in your mouth and your heart. That's from Deuteronomy 30. But then he goes on and says, that is the word of faith. That is the word of faith we are proclaiming. So Paul has gone back to the law in this point and said it was really, Moses said, what's in your heart and what do you confess with your mouth? And that's the word of faith we are proclaiming. And he narrows it down to some sentences, which I think, again, I take as literally being true. Some people have a problem with that, but not myself. If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So there's a confession with the mouth and a belief with the heart, and he says the result of that is you will be saved. And in verse 10 it says, for it is with your heart that you believe and are justified. So he's saying the way we come to Christ, the way we are justified is a decision really that we make in our heart. And it is with your mouth that you confess and are saved. And if we looked at Paul's definition of salvation in Romans, the whole book of Romans, we'll see it's a much wider definition than just the justification by faith, which of course he's the champion of that also. And so he goes to the Scripture, and he says there's promises in Scripture that have to be fulfilled in this. So when we go against the idea that a man can believe and have this results, we're going against Scripture. He says, as the Scripture says, anyone who trusts in him will never be put to shame. For there's no difference between Jew and Gentile. Here we understand that the faith is really a trust. Okay, anyone who trusts in him will not be put to shame. For there's no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord over all, of all, and richly blesses all who call on the name. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Now he goes into an important part, and we're running low on time here, but he goes into a logical sequence here. We'd say that that faith is a gift from God, and I agree with that. I mean, he made promises to Abraham, or Abraham never would have been able to believe those promises. If the promises were not there, there was nothing to believe. So God gives faith. God gives us and gives us all the elements within our free will to make a free will choice to trust, to believe. And he goes through that, and he says, how then can they call on him who they've not believed in? So he's saying to have faith, they got to call on someone they believed in. How can they believe if they've not heard? How can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can they preach unless they're sent? And then he says, it's how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. And so then he applies this to Israel. And I think his application to Israel here is very important. Notice he's saying the faith comes by God, and his sovereign workings brings you the word, and then you're able to believe. But in that is, he says in verse 17, consequently faith comes from hearing the message. And the message is heard through the word of Christ. He says, he points out, not all the Israelites accepted the good news, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? And the faith comes from hearing the message. So here we're understanding about faith. Faith is a gift of God. God gives us the message. That's the way we're able to believe. And I think that the continuation of that we will look at in another video, and it's very important, the logic and the things he says about faith and hearing in regards to Israel. And I think there are some principles there we can apply and understand how really the ball's in our court with our free will, what we're going to do with this.